The Desert Dream, September 1, 1984, Sabha, southern Libya. The desert shimmered like liquid gold beneath the ruthless sun. The air was dry enough to crack lips within minutes, and the horizon trembled, as if even the light itself struggled to survive. Yet, standing in that inferno, surrounded by endless dunes, one man smiled. Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, in his olive-green uniform and trademark sunglasses, stared into the distance where engineers had begun marking lines in the sand. Bulldozers roared, their metal treads sinking deep into the soft dunes, a mirage of movement, but this time. It wasn't the heat playing tricks, it was history beginning to stir. He turned to his entourage, a mix of Libyan officials and foreign consultants, and said with quiet conviction, "Beneath this desert lies an ocean. And we will bring it to the surface." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Some believed him, others thought he'd gone mad. The Sahara was no place for rivers, and yet Gaddafi's eyes burned with certainty. For years, Libyan geologists had been mapping the underground aquifers beneath the southern desert, vast, ancient reservoirs of fossil water trapped for thousands of years beneath the sands. Water that could turn the barren heart of Libya into fertile farmland, but to reach it, they would need to drill deeper than any nation had ever dared. To transport it, they'd have to build a network of underground pipelines stretching over 2,800 kilometers, a project so massive it would rival the Great Wall of China in scale. The world laughed. Western engineers called it Gaddafi's pipe dream. American intelligence analysts at the CIA dismissed it as propaganda. One leaked report even described it as technically implausible and financially suicidal, but Gaddafi didn't blink. He raised billions from Libya's oil exports, ordered the creation of a state-run company called the Great Man-Made River Authority, and hired engineers from across the globe, not to seek permission, but to make the impossible real. As the first drills bit into the earth, sand hissed underfoot, the sound echoed like whispers of defiance. Every rotation of the drill was an act of rebellion against nature, and against the West that had written off Libya as just another desert state. Down in the excavation pits, Libyan workers wiped sweat from their faces as they operated the massive rigs. They drilled hundreds of meters below the surface, through solid rock, through layers of ancient sand. Then one day, it happened. A roar, a rush, a burst of life. Water erupted from the ground like a geyser, cool, clear, and endless. The men shouted, dropped their tools, and ran to touch it. For the first time in living memory, the Sahara had a heartbeat. News spread fast. Across the Middle East and Africa, people called it a miracle. But in Washington and London, intelligence officers frowned at their reports. Libya, the same country once bombed by the United States, was now pulling off one of the most ambitious engineering projects in history. Without Western aid, it wasn't just a river. It was independence, liquid independence, and that, more than anything, terrified the powers that had always controlled the world's resources. Gaddafi walked through the drilling site that night, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. Under a canopy of stars, he stood beside the flowing pipe and said to one of his aides, "Let them call me crazy. But soon, they will come to drink from our wells." The great man-made river had begun, not as a miracle, but as a challenge. And the desert, once silent, was now listening. The birth of the great man-made river. The sun rose again over Sabha, spilling gold over the dunes that now echoed with the hum of heavy machinery. Where once there had been only silence and wind, there was now movement, precision, and purpose. It was 1985, and the Great Man-Made River project was officially underway. From the air, the desert resembled a colossal construction site. Giant trenches stretched across the horizon, straight, deep, and endless. Convoys of trucks carried enormous concrete pipes, each 12 feet wide and weighing more than 75 tons. They rolled like silver snakes through the sand, ready to be buried beneath it. Every day, under the merciless heat, teams of Libyan engineers and laborers worked side by side with experts from South Korea, Britain, and Germany. Dust clung to their faces, and the roar of machinery filled the air. They were building a system that would carry 6.5 million cubic meters of water every day, enough to supply every Libyan city and turn dry wastelands into farmland. To the average Libyan, it was more than a project. It was hope, but for Gaddafi, it was something deeper. It was a declaration that Libya could stand on its own, that oil wealth could fuel something greater than palaces or weapons. He wanted to show the world that the desert could bloom without Western permission. The scale was staggering. More than 1,300 wells would be drilled, some reaching depths of 500 meters. Over 4,000 kilometers of massive pipelines would connect the southern aquifers to the coastal cities of Benghazi, Tripoli, and Sirte. The cost? More than $25 billion, all paid for by Libya's own money. Not a single loan from the World Bank, not a single cent from the IMF. Gaddafi gave the order himself. We will not beg, we will build. The CIA took notice. Declassified reports from the mid-1980s reveal growing alarm within U.S. intelligence circles. They had underestimated what Libya could accomplish with oil money and national unity. Satellite images showed massive activity in the Sahara, convoys, drilling rigs, and construction zones the size of small towns. Analysts called it the largest civil engineering project in history, and it was happening under the leadership of a man Washington had long labeled a mad dictator. But as Libya dug deeper, the political temperature around it began to rise. Western media ridiculed the project, calling it a vanity monument, another pharaoh's pyramid. But behind closed doors, some leaders were worried. If Libya succeeded, it would prove that Africa didn't need the West to solve its problems. That technology and progress could come from within the continent itself. Meanwhile, in the Libyan desert, workers labored day and night. The construction sites glowed like tiny constellations against the black dunes. Under floodlights, welders sealed giant pipeline segments together, each connection symbolizing a step closer to Gaddafi's dream. One engineer later recalled, "When we saw the water flow for the first time, we cried. It was like watching the Sahara come alive." By 1989, the first phase of the Great Man-Made River was nearing completion. Pipelines ran from the southern wells of Surir and Tazerbo to Benghazi and Sirte. Water that had slept underground for tens of thousands of years now flowed freely across Libya, through concrete veins, beneath scorching sand, into cities where children played in fountains that had never existed before. And on September 28, 1989, Gaddafi stood before a massive crowd in Benghazi. Behind him, fountains of crystal water shot into the air, the desert, celebrating its rebirth. He spoke slowly, proudly, his voice carried through loudspeakers to thousands of Libyans. "This is the eighth wonder of the world. This is the answer to our prayers." They said it could not be done. But here we are, drinking from the desert. The crowd erupted, chanting his name. But beyond Libya's borders, a different kind of murmur was spreading, one of unease. Because the great man-made river wasn't just watering Libya. It was watering an idea that Africa could control its own destiny. The river that challenged empires. The success of the first phase of the Great Man-Made River sent shockwaves far beyond Libya's borders. By the early 1990s, satellite imagery showed a sprawling network of pipelines carving through the desert, a literal artery system for the nation. Entire towns had sprung up around the project sites. Schools, hospitals, and power plants were built to support the thousands of workers who had come to turn Gaddafi's vision into reality. Libya was no longer just an oil state, it was becoming a model of self-reliance in a continent often exploited for its resources. But to the West, that was precisely the problem. In Washington, London, and Paris, policymakers viewed Gaddafi's success not as a miracle, but as a message. He had built the largest irrigation network on Earth without borrowing a single dollar from Western banks. He had proven that oil wealth could fund national development instead of foreign debt. And worse, he was offering the blueprint to the rest of Africa. In speeches across the continent, Gaddafi urged other leaders to join him in creating an African economic alliance, one that could share resources, create a gold-backed African currency, and free the continent from IMF control. "They control you through thirst," he once told a gathering of African leaders. But water, like freedom, should belong to the people. To the CIA and MI6, this was more than rhetoric, it was rebellion. Classified documents later revealed that Western intelligence agencies had begun monitoring the project closely. Not because of its engineering value, but because of its geopolitical implications. A Libya that could feed itself, electrify its cities, and inspire other African nations was a threat to the balance of power. And yet, inside Libya, the transformation was undeniable. In the city of Idabia, children who once fetched water from distant wells now drank from taps. In Benghazi, Parks and gardens bloomed where there had only been dust. Farmers in the coastal plains began growing wheat, barley, and citrus, crops once unthinkable in the desert. The Libyan government subsidized farming equipment, encouraged rural settlement, and distributed land to families. Gaddafi called it the Green Dream, a future where Libya could feed not only itself, but its neighbors. But there was another layer, one few dared to say out loud. The great man-made river didn't just deliver water, it delivered independence. And independence, in a world run by oil and money, was dangerous. By 1996, the system had expanded into multiple phases. New pipelines stretched toward Tripoli and Misrata, and the project's cost soared beyond $30 billion. Still, it remained entirely Libyan-funded. Each pipeline segment bore the inscription, "Made in Libya, for Libya." That small line infuriated Western corporations that had been excluded from lucrative contracts. The CIA noted in one internal memo that Libya's self-contained development model could inspire copycat projects in other resource-rich nations, undermining Western influence, and yet, Gaddafi pressed on. He invited African leaders to visit the pumping stations and the massive reservoirs built deep in the desert. Many left astonished. "It is the real Nile," one Sudanese delegate whispered. But underground, by 2007, the river had reached its final stages, stretching over 4,000 kilometers, supplying over 70% of Libya's population with fresh water. It was officially recognized as the largest underground water project ever constructed. But that same year, the murmurs in Western diplomatic cables grew louder. The US had imposed sanctions, and Libya was increasingly portrayed as unstable. Gaddafi's growing calls for African unity, backed by oil money and water power, made him a pariah again. And in the eyes of those who ruled the global order, the great man-made river wasn't just a pipeline. It was a symbol, one that had to be destroyed before it inspired a continent. The river falls silent March 19, 2011, Sirte, Libya. The sound came first, a deep, rolling thunder that didn't belong to the sky. It was the roar of jet engines. Moments later, explosions shattered the desert calm. The NATO intervention in Libya had begun. Missiles streaked across the horizon, striking communication towers, radar stations, and something else. In the desert south of Sirte, one of the great man-made river's main water facilities, the Briga pumping plant, went up in flames. The blast tore through concrete, machinery, and steel pipelines that had once carried life across the nation. Within hours, millions of Libyans lost access to clean water. To most of the world, it was a footnote in the chaos of war. But to those who understood what the project meant, the symbolism was chilling. The largest irrigation network in human history, the lifeline of a self-reliant Africa, had been crippled in a single night. As the bombs fell, engineers and technicians risked their lives to shut off valves and prevent further damage. Flames rose from the pumping stations, lighting the desert like a funeral pyre. It was not a military target, one Libyan engineer later said bitterly. It was water. "They bombed our water." In the years that followed, evidence surfaced suggesting that the strike on the Briga facility was not accidental. The CIA had long known that Libya's water infrastructure was one of Gaddafi's proudest achievements and one of his strongest tools of influence across Africa. Damaging it didn't just weaken the Libyan state. It erased a symbol of independence that no sanction could touch. Inside Tripoli, chaos reigned. As the capital burned, the once mighty pipelines lay buried under sand and silence. The engineers who had built them fled or were killed. The factories that produced the massive concrete pipes were looted. The dream that had made the desert bloom was collapsing, not from nature's fury, but from man's. Gaddafi's final public speech came just months later. In a voice trembling with anger and heartbreak, he declared, "They are destroying our homes, our power, our water. They want Libya to return to thirst, to the days of the well and the bucket." He was right. By the time NATO's campaign ended, much of the great man-made river's infrastructure lay damaged or abandoned. Without maintenance, the vast network began to decay. Cracks spread through the pipelines, pumps stopped working. The desert, once conquered, began reclaiming what was hers. And then, on October 20, 2011, near his hometown of Sirte, Muammar Gaddafi was captured and killed. The man who had made the desert bloom was left to die in the dust he once defied. But death did not erase his creation entirely. Even now, years later, the great man-made river still runs, quietly, stubbornly under the sands. Engineers in Libya continue to fight to keep it alive, patching broken lines, restarting old wells, refusing to let it die completely. Today, it still supplies water to millions, though at a fraction of its former glory. The desert remains scarred, but not defeated. And somewhere beneath those endless dunes, the underground ocean still sleeps, waiting, perhaps, for another dreamer bold enough to wake it again. Because Gaddafi was right about one thing: there was water under the sand. Enough to feed a nation, enough to make the world question who really controlled progress. The CIA couldn't believe it, but Libya, even in silence, proved it true. If you enjoyed the video, click the like button and subscribe for more video. Thank you for watching.